Nobody believed a girl who looked barely 20 could save them. The turbulence was killing everyone. Their hearts stopped when military jets appeared. Then the F-16 commander called her by a secret name. In 3 words, everything changed. "Welcome back, ma'am." Passengers learned their young pilot was actually a military legend. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the airport terminal as passengers gathered at Gate 24. Flight 847 to Denver was boarding soon. Among the crowd of business travelers and families, a young woman in a pilot's uniform walked toward the gate with quiet confidence. Captain Sarah Mitchell looked barely 20 years old. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her face was fresh and youthful. The 4 gold stripes on her uniform shoulders showed she was a captain, but many passengers did a double take when they saw her. She looked too young to be flying a commercial airplane. Sarah was actually 28 years old, but she had always looked much younger than her age. After 7 years of flying military fighter jets, she had left that world behind. She wanted a quieter life flying commercial planes. But her young appearance made this new career harder than she expected. As Sarah approached the gate desk, she heard an elderly man whisper to his wife. "I hope there's a real pilot flying today. That girl looks like she just finished school." Sarah had heard comments like this many times in the past 6 months since joining the airline. She had learned to ignore them. She knew that actions spoke louder than words. Patricia, the gate agent, smiled at Sarah with sympathy. "Don't worry about them, Captain. Your safety record is one of the best in the airline." "Thank you, Patricia," Sarah said warmly before heading down the jetway to the plane. Inside the Boeing 737 cockpit, Sarah found her first officer already working through the pre-flight checks. First Officer David Chin was 52 years old with 25 years of commercial flying experience. He looked up as Sarah entered. "Good morning, Captain," David said. "I was just checking the weather. There's a storm system along our route. We'll need to watch for turbulence." David spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a student. He clearly thought Sarah needed his guidance, even though she was the captain. Sarah listened politely and nodded. She didn't mention that she had flown through conditions far worse than any commercial flight would face. During her military years, she had flown combat missions through enemy fire and dangerous weather. Compared to that, turbulence was manageable. "I appreciate the update," Sarah said simply, settling into the captain's seat. She began her instrument checks with quick, precise movements. Her hands moved across the switches and displays with the confidence that came from thousands of hours in cockpits. David watched her with slight surprise. Her movements were smoother than most new captains he had flown with. The weather report showed moderate to severe turbulence expected along their route. David suggested they request a different path to avoid the worst areas. Sarah studied the weather data carefully. Her mind automatically calculated wind patterns and pressure systems. She had spent years making quick decisions in 3-dimensional combat situations. Reading weather patterns was second nature to her. Passengers began boarding the aircraft. Several of them glanced nervously into the cockpit when they passed. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped and spoke to the flight attendant. "Is that young lady really going to fly this plane?" he asked, pointing at Sarah. "Yes, sir. Captain Mitchell is your pilot today," the flight attendant replied politely. "I want to speak to a supervisor," the man said firmly. "She looks too young. I'm not comfortable with this." The lead flight attendant, Jennifer, had seen reactions like this before. "Sir, all our pilots meet the highest standards. Captain Mitchell has completed the same training as every other captain." The businessman sat down reluctantly, still muttering complaints. Sarah heard the entire conversation through her headset. She kept her focus on the instrument panel. She had learned during her military service that proving yourself through action was better than defending yourself with words. David tried to be supportive. Passengers always calm down once they see professional flying, he said. But his tone suggested he thought Sarah might need reassurance. Sarah just smiled. I'm sure they will. The boarding process finished smoothly. Soon the flight attendants secured the cabin, and Sarah and David completed their final checks. Ground control gave them clearance to push back from the gate. Sarah maneuvered the large aircraft through the morning traffic at the busy airport. Her radio communications were crisp and clear. She acknowledged every instruction with professional efficiency. David watched her handle the plane with growing surprise. Her control of the aircraft was smoother than he expected from a newly promoted captain. Tower control cleared Flight 847 for takeoff. Sarah advanced the throttles smoothly. The engines powered up, and the Boeing 737 accelerated down the runway. Sarah made tiny corrections to keep the plane perfectly centered. At the right speed, she pulled back gently on the controls, and the aircraft lifted into the morning sky. The takeoff was textbook perfect. The plane climbed smoothly as the landing gear retracted. David called out airspeeds and altitudes while monitoring the engines. Sarah acknowledged each call-out while flying the departure procedure carefully. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, David began offering advice. Newer captains sometimes feel pressure to turn off the seatbelt sign quickly, he said in a fatherly tone. But with this weather ahead, you should keep it on longer. Safety comes first. I understand, Sarah said. Thank you. She appreciated David's good intentions, even though his assumptions about her experience were completely wrong. During her military years, she had flown through conditions that would have destroyed most aircraft. She didn't need reminders about prioritizing safety. The flight continued smoothly for the first hour. They cruised at 35,000 feet through clear skies. But ahead, the weather radar began showing angry patches of red and yellow. A storm was building along their route. David pointed at the radar. We should request a deviation to the north. The weather looks less intense there. Experienced pilots always avoid the worst storms. Sarah studied the radar carefully. Her tactical mind ran through multiple scenarios. She considered fuel reserves, alternate airports, and the aircraft's capabilities. A northern deviation makes sense, she agreed. She contacted air traffic control and requested the route change. The controller approved immediately and gave them new heading instructions. David relaxed slightly. Making good decisions about weather is one of the most important skills for captains, he commented. Sarah nodded, but she kept watching the weather carefully. The storm was developing faster than the forecasts predicted. The gaps between storm cells were closing. They might not be able to avoid turbulence even with the deviation. David seemed unaware of how quickly the situation was changing. His decades of commercial flying had given him confidence that modern radar and careful routing could keep them away from dangerous conditions. 20 minutes later, the aircraft suddenly jolted. They had hit the leading edge of turbulence that the radar hadn't shown clearly. The Boeing 737 bounced and shuddered as invisible forces grabbed the plane. David quickly grabbed the microphone. Flight attendants, take your seats immediately. Sarah's hands moved instinctively to the controls. Her responses came from deep muscle memory built during thousands of hours of flying. She made continuous tiny adjustments to maintain altitude and heading through the rough air. The turbulence intensified rapidly. The aircraft began experiencing violent up and down movements. Anything not secured was thrown around the cabin. Several passengers cried out in fear. David's voice tightened with concern. We should request an altitude change. We need to find smoother air. Sarah was already ahead of him. She keyed the radio. Denver Center, Flight 847 requesting immediate climb to 37,000 feet. Flight 847, climb approved to 370, the controller responded immediately. Sarah began a careful climb while fighting the severe turbulence. The plane was being thrown around with forces that exceeded anything David had experienced in his entire career. The businessman who had complained about Sarah's age was now gripping his armrests with white knuckles. His confidence had vanished. Flight attendants strapped themselves into jump seats while trying to calm passengers who thought they were going to die. Children cried. Adults prayed. The aircraft structure creaked and groaned under the stress. The climb to 37,000 feet brought no relief. The turbulence actually got worse. Sarah realized with cold clarity that they had flown into a severe thunderstorm that was more dangerous than anything standard training prepared pilots to handle. The aircraft was being thrown up and down violently. David openly showed fear now, gripping his seat as he called out altitude changes that exceeded 1,000 feet in seconds. Sarah's fighter pilot training took over completely. She stopped treating this like a commercial aviation emergency. She started flying like a combat mission where survival depended on advanced skills. Her control inputs became more aggressive and tactical. She used techniques designed for controlling unstable fighter jets in extreme conditions. David watched in shock as Sarah somehow maintained control despite turbulence that should have been overwhelming. Her face showed intense concentration but no panic. Her hands moved across the controls with impossible precision despite how violently the plane was being thrown around. The aircraft suddenly dropped what felt like 2,000 feet in seconds. They had hit a massive downdraft. "We need to declare an emergency," David shouted. Sarah was already moving. She fought the descent, adjusted power settings, and keyed the radio simultaneously. Denver Center, Flight 847 declaring emergency. Severe turbulence. We need immediate descent and diversion to nearest suitable airport. Flight 847, Roger. Emergency declared. We're clearing traffic. Multiple airports available. Stand by for. A different voice suddenly cut into the frequency. The voice had military authority that instantly changed everything. Denver Center, this is Major Kate Reynolds, F-16 Fighting Falcon Commander, 55th Fighter Squadron. We're monitoring this frequency. Request confirmation of civilian aircraft tail number and captain identity. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Military aircraft were in the area and had identified her plane somehow. But she had to respond professionally while still fighting the violent turbulence. This is November 847 Charlie. Captain Sarah Mitchell, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. There was a brief pause. Then Major Reynolds' voice returned with a tone that David immediately recognized as carrying profound military respect. Captain Mitchell, we've confirmed your identity through military databases. I want to acknowledge your presence in our airspace. Then the F-16 commander added words that would change everything. Her voice carried unmistakable reverence. It's an honor to have Colonel Sarah Viper Mitchell flying through our airspace. Welcome back, ma'am. The impact of those words hit David like a physical blow. He stared at Sarah with complete shock. Colonel was a high military rank that required years of exceptional service. Having an F-16 squadron commander address her with such formal respect meant Sarah had accomplished extraordinary things during her military career. David suddenly understood that the young woman sitting next to him wasn't a new captain learning to handle challenges. She was a highly decorated military officer whose skills and experience exceeded anything he had imagined possible. But Sarah had no time to address David's shock. The turbulence suddenly intensified beyond what they had already experienced. The aircraft was being pushed beyond its design limits. They were seconds away from either breaking apart in mid-air or losing so much altitude that recovery would be impossible. Sarah pushed the throttles to maximum power while simultaneously pushing the nose down into a steep descent. It seemed suicidal, but she knew exactly what she was doing. She was using gravity and airspeed to punch through the worst downdrafts instead of being carried helplessly downward. You're diving too steep. Pull up. David shouted in panic. Sarah ignored him. She knew what she was doing based on experience David could never understand. The airspeed increased rapidly as they descended at angles that triggered every warning system. But Sarah kept her focus locked on the instruments, making continuous adjustments that kept the aircraft flying. The turbulence began to decrease as they punched through the worst part of the storm. Within 60 seconds, they had fought their way clear. They were now flying in rough but manageable conditions that felt almost calm compared to what they had just survived. Major Reynolds' voice came back on the frequency. "Flight 847, do you require assistance?" "Negative," Sarah responded. "We've successfully navigated through the severe weather. Requesting vectors to nearest airport for immediate landing." "Roger that, Captain. We're coordinating with Denver Center to give you priority handling. I'm authorizing you to use Buckley Air Force Base. It's 40 miles ahead with better weather and longer runways. Emergency response teams will be standing by." "Thank you, Major." Flight 847 accepting Buckley. Sarah began her approach preparations, her hands already moving through checklists with automatic precision. David finally found his voice. "What does your call sign Viper mean? What did you do in the military that earned that kind of respect?" Sarah kept her focus on flying the approach. "I spent 7 years as a fighter pilot," she said simply. "I flew combat missions in multiple areas. I eventually commanded my own squadron before I retired and joined the airline." She didn't elaborate on the specific missions or achievements that had made her a legend in the military aviation community. David understood enough to realize he had been flying with someone whose skills exceeded his own by a huge margin, despite her young appearance. The approach to Buckley Air Force Base proceeded smoothly. Sarah brought the Boeing 737 down through the clouds with precision that reflected thousands of hours of landing experience. The passengers remained quiet and shaken in the cabin, unaware that they had only survived because their young pilot possessed extraordinary abilities. Sarah configured the aircraft for landing while running through checklists with David, who now assisted her with new respect. The runway appeared ahead through the clearing weather. Sarah flew a perfect approach and touched down smoothly despite crosswinds from the storm. Emergency vehicles followed them as Sarah taxied to the military terminal. She completed the shutdown checklist with David. The cabin crew began explaining to passengers that they had diverted to a military facility for safety reasons, but that buses would transport everyone to continue their journey. David looked at Sarah with completely new eyes. "I've been patronizing you this entire flight," he said quietly. "I was offering advice and assuming you needed guidance. I apologize for not recognizing your experience and capabilities." Sarah accepted his apology graciously. "I deliberately chose not to advertise my military background. I wanted to succeed as a commercial pilot on my own merits. Your advice about passenger management was actually valuable, since those aspects are genuinely new to me." David smiled with relief that she wasn't offended. "Watching you fly through that turbulence was both terrifying and amazing. I've never seen anyone control an aircraft with such skill under those conditions." The passengers began leaving the plane with shaky legs and profound relief. Many looked at Sarah with new confusion as they passed through the cockpit area. They were trying to understand how the young pilot they had doubted had somehow saved their lives. The businessman who had complained loudest stopped at the cockpit door. "I owe you an apology," he said awkwardly. "I questioned your capabilities based on your appearance. Thank you for bringing us down safely. I'm certain we would have crashed with anyone else flying." Sarah accepted his thanks with quiet dignity. "I just did my job exactly as I was trained to do." Major Kate Reynolds arrived at the aircraft 20 minutes later. She was a tall officer in her early 40s with the confident bearing of someone who had flown the most demanding missions. Her eyes showed immediate recognition and respect when she saw Sarah. She approached with military formality and extended her hand. "Colonel Mitchell, it's an honor." Sarah shook her hand. "Thank you for your assistance during the emergency." "Any aviator would have helped," Major Reynolds replied. "But I was honored to provide support to someone whose reputation makes her a legend." I've studied several of your combat missions during tactical training. The maneuvers you executed have become teaching examples. David listened with growing amazement as pieces of Sarah's background emerged. Every fighter pilot in the Air Force knows the call sign Viper, Major Reynolds continued. The stories about your capabilities sometimes seem too extraordinary to believe, until you see your record and confirm everything is true. Sarah looked uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what needed to be done. Many other aviators performed equally well. Major Reynolds smiled at her modesty. Very few pilots earned the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, or commanded a squadron at age 26, or received personal commendations from 4-star generals. David's jaw dropped. The Distinguished Flying Cross was one of the highest decorations for extraordinary heroism during flight operations. Receiving it twice meant sustained excellence under the most demanding circumstances. Commanding a squadron in her 20s meant exceptional leadership abilities. The conversation shifted to the Turbulence encounter. Major Reynolds asked Sarah for her assessment of the conditions and whether the aircraft had sustained damage. Sarah described the situation professionally, explaining the techniques she had used to maintain control when standard procedures became inadequate. Your decision to execute an aggressive descent through the downdrafts rather than trying to climb showed tactical thinking that probably saved the aircraft from structural failure, Major Reynolds said. David finally asked the question that had been on his mind. Why did you leave military aviation to become a commercial pilot when you clearly could have continued at the highest levels? Sarah was quiet for a moment. 7 years of combat operations took their toll in ways that aren't immediately visible. I loved flying fighters and serving my country, but I realized I needed to step away before it consumed everything. Commercial aviation offered a way to continue flying while having a more balanced life. Major Reynolds understood completely. The Air Force misses having you, but your contributions earned you the right to choose whatever path makes sense for your life. I occasionally miss the challenge of fighter flying, Sarah admitted. But overall, I'm satisfied with my decision, even when it means dealing with people who underestimate me based on my appearance. The airline sent representatives to coordinate passenger transportation and aircraft recovery. When company officials reviewed the cockpit recordings and flight data, technical experts were stunned. The recorded parameters showed the aircraft had been subjected to forces far beyond normal operations. Yet Sarah had maintained control throughout with skills that seemed impossible. One senior captain with 40 years of experience admitted after reviewing the data that he would not have survived the encounter. The control inputs required went beyond anything taught in commercial training. Word spread rapidly through the airline about what had actually happened on Flight 847. Sarah's hidden military background became known throughout the pilot community. Pilots who had viewed her as just another young captain suddenly realized they had been flying with someone whose experience exceeded most of theirs combined. The businessman contacted customer service specifically to commend Sarah's professionalism. He mentioned in his letter that she had saved his life through abilities that came from elite military training. David told Sarah privately that he would never again make assumptions about someone's capabilities based on appearance. I'll be honored to fly with you again, he said. Though I promise to skip the patronizing advice next time. Sarah appreciated his honesty. Your commercial aviation expertise complements my military background. We make an effective crew. The passengers eventually continued to Denver on another aircraft. Sarah remained at the base to coordinate with maintenance teams inspecting the Boeing 737. Major Reynolds invited her to visit the fighter squadron, but Sarah politely declined. I'm trying to maintain clear separation between my military past and commercial present. But I appreciate the invitation. Major Reynolds respected her decision. The fighter pilot community will always consider you one of our own, regardless of what aircraft you fly. As Sarah prepared to return to her home base, she reflected on the day's events. The severe turbulence had forced her hidden background into the open despite her efforts to keep it private. She had wanted to succeed on her own merits without relying on her service record. But the emergency had required skills that could only come from elite training. The situation had revealed her true identity to everyone on Flight 847. It would inevitably spread throughout the airline. But she accepted that some secrets were impossible to maintain when circumstances demanded capabilities beyond normal qualifications. Looking back at the military airfield, Sarah felt mixed emotions. Part of her missed the challenge and adrenaline of military aviation. But another part remembered why she had chosen to step away in search of a more balanced career. The day had proven that leaving military flying hadn't diminished her skills. Knowing she could still perform at the highest level when required gave her confidence that she had made the right choice. The airline formally recognized Sarah's exceptional performance by presenting her with their highest safety award. Sarah accepted it with characteristic modesty. Safety requires pilots to maintain their skills at the highest level regardless of what type of flying they do, she said in her speech. My military training helped during the turbulence, but any well-trained pilot could have handled it by focusing on fundamental skills and staying calm under pressure. Some pilots smiled knowingly. They had reviewed the flight data and understood that Sarah significantly understated what had actually been required. David became one of Sarah's strongest advocates. He made sure to correct anyone who expressed doubts about young pilots or suggested experience could be judged by appearance. He told the story of flying with Colonel Viper Mitchell through turbulence that nearly destroyed their aircraft, and how her skills saved everyone while he watched in amazed helplessness. His accounts helped change attitudes throughout the airline about making assumptions based on superficial characteristics. Sarah gradually became more comfortable with her military background being known. She occasionally shared insights from her fighter pilot experience during training sessions. She emphasized that tactical thinking and situational awareness from combat missions could improve safety in commercial aviation. Younger pilots found her perspectives valuable for developing their own skills. She remained humble about her achievements while acknowledging that her military service had given her capabilities that proved valuable when circumstances demanded performance beyond standard procedures. The passengers from Flight 847 never forgot their brush with disaster or the young pilot who saved their lives. Several wrote personal letters to Sarah thanking her. Many admitted feeling ashamed about doubting her before takeoff based on her appearance. Sarah responded graciously to each letter. She said she understood their initial concerns and held no grudges. Your skepticism came from natural protective instincts, not malicious intent. The businessman became one of Sarah's most vocal supporters. He told everyone about nearly dying before being saved by a legendary fighter pilot. His story spread through social media, and Sarah became something of a minor celebrity despite preferring privacy. She handled the attention with grace while redirecting focus toward the broader point that capabilities should be judged by demonstrated performance rather than superficial characteristics. Major Reynolds stayed in touch with Sarah through occasional emails about aviation and transitioning between military and civilian careers. She mentioned that several younger pilots had been inspired by Sarah's service record and decision to pursue commercial aviation. 6 months after the emergency, Sarah was promoted to check airman status based on her exceptional flying skills and growing reputation. The position allowed her to train and evaluate other pilots. She approached the responsibility with the dedication she had brought to commanding a squadron years earlier. She found satisfaction in helping newer pilots develop their capabilities while sharing lessons from years of flying in demanding environments. The story of Captain Sarah Viper Mitchell and Flight 847 eventually became a legend within aviation circles. It was told and retold as an example of how appearances can deceive and how exceptional ability sometimes hides behind unexpected exteriors. Pilots shared the story during training sessions to illustrate points about making good decisions under pressure and recognizing that experience takes many forms beyond conventional wisdom. Sarah remained humble about the episode while quietly appreciating that one turbulence encounter had taught everyone involved important lessons about assumptions, capabilities, and judging people by their actions rather than appearances. The elderly couple who had worried about Sarah's youth wrote her a particularly touching letter months later. They explained that they had spent their lives making snap judgments about people based on superficial characteristics. Nearly dying while being saved by someone they had unfairly doubted had taught them to approach others with more open minds. Sarah kept that letter in her flight bag as a reminder that even difficult experiences could produce positive outcomes when people remained willing to learn and grow. Flying commercial routes through routine skies would never match the intensity of combat missions. But Sarah found genuine fulfillment knowing her daily work kept hundreds of passengers safe while allowing her to maintain the passion for aviation that had defined her life since childhood. Colonel Sarah "Viper" Mitchell continued flying commercial aircraft for years to come. She built a reputation as one of the finest captains in the airline while never forgetting the military service that shaped her capabilities. The fighter pilot community would always consider her one of their own, regardless of what aircraft she flew or uniform she wore. Her story became a powerful reminder that true capability isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are those who look most ordinary. And sometimes the person you underestimate is exactly the person who will save your life. The next time passengers saw a young pilot walking toward their aircraft, many remembered Sarah's story. They learned to look past appearances and trust in the training, experience, and dedication that every pilot brings to the cockpit. Because in the end, what matters isn't how old you look or how young you appear. What matters is what you can do when everything is on the line and lives depend on your skills, your training, and your courage. Captain Sarah Mitchell proved that lesson at 35,000 feet in the middle of a deadly storm. And she continued to prove it every single day she flew. 5 years passed since that fateful day on Flight 847. Sarah Mitchell had become more than just a captain. She was now the airline's chief training officer, responsible for developing the next generation of pilots. Her office wall displayed her awards, but what she treasured most was a framed photograph of Flight 847's passengers who had returned for a reunion on the anniversary of their survival. David Chen had retired from flying, but he visited Sarah often. They had become close friends, bonded by that day when death had come so close. He often told new pilots, "I thought I was mentoring her, but she was the one who taught me the most important lesson of my career." The elderly couple from Flight 847, Martha and George Williams, sent Sarah a card every year on the anniversary. This year's card included a photo of their great-granddaughter wearing a pilot's uniform. "She wants to be just like you," they wrote. "We tell her your story all the time. She knows that courage has no age limit." Sarah's story had changed training programs across the aviation industry. Flight schools now included case studies of her emergency handling. The FAA used her cockpit recordings as teaching material. Not for the technical skills alone, but for the broader lesson about hidden capabilities and the danger of assumptions. Young pilots, especially women, reached out to Sarah constantly. She received hundreds of emails from aspiring aviators who faced doubt because of their age, gender, or appearance. Sarah responded to each one personally. Her message was always the same: let your skills speak. Actions prove what words cannot. Major Kate Reynolds had also stayed in touch. She had since been promoted to colonel and commanded an entire fighter wing. She invited Sarah to speak at the Air Force Academy twice. Both times, Sarah's speeches received standing ovations from cadets who saw in her the possibility of different paths, second chapters, and lives beyond the military. The businessman from Flight 847, Robert Chen, had done something extraordinary. Moved by his experience, he established a scholarship foundation for young pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. He named it the Second Chance Foundation because, as he explained, "Sarah gave me a second chance at life. Now I want to give others a second chance at their dreams." The foundation had already helped 50 young people earn their pilot's licenses. 3 of them now flew for Sarah's airline. Robert attended every graduation ceremony, telling each new pilot about the day he almost died because he judged a book by its cover. Sarah had found balance in her life. She married Tom, a high school teacher who had no connection to aviation. He loved her for who she was, not for her achievements. They had a daughter named Hope, who was now 3 years old. Hope loved watching planes, but Sarah never pushed her toward flying. "She'll find her own path," Sarah would say. On weekends, Sarah volunteered at a youth center, teaching girls about aviation and STEM careers. She brought in female pilots, engineers, and air traffic controllers. Her message was simple but powerful: your dreams are valid, no matter what anyone says. I looked too young. Some of you might feel too different. But different is not less. Different is just different. The airline had retired the actual Boeing 737 that had been Flight 847. But they didn't scrap it. Instead, they donated it to an aviation museum. The aircraft sat in the main hall, and next to it was an exhibit telling the story of that day. Visitors could sit in replica cockpit seats and listen to the actual audio recording of the emergency. The exhibit's final panel showed Sarah's photo in her military uniform next to one in her commercial pilot uniform. The caption read, "Captain Sarah Viper Mitchell, a reminder that heroes don't always look like we expect them to." Sarah often thought about that turbulent day 5 years ago. Not with fear or pride, but with gratitude. Grateful that she had the skills to save those lives. Grateful that the experience had taught so many people such an important lesson. Grateful that one emergency had started conversations about bias and assumptions across the entire aviation industry. She knew that somewhere, right now, a young pilot was facing doubt. Someone was being underestimated because of how they looked. And she hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone would remember her story and give that pilot a chance to prove themselves. Because talent doesn't have an age. Skill doesn't have a gender. Capability doesn't have a certain look. Sometimes the person who looks least likely to save you is exactly the person who will. And sometimes, when you're falling through the sky with death approaching fast, the young face in the cockpit is the face of an angel who's been to war and back, who's flown through hell and survived, who's commanded squadrons and earned medals you've never heard of. Sometimes that young pilot is a colonel. Sometimes that girl is a legend. And sometimes, "Welcome back, ma'am," are the 3 most beautiful words 100 terrified passengers will ever hear.